Imagine standing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The temperature is below freezing. The sky is completely dark. There is no moon, no land, no rescue in sight. Around you, thousands of people are screaming for help as the largest ship ever built slowly disappears beneath the ocean. Within just a few hours, over 1,500 people would lose their lives in one of history's deadliest peacetime maritime disasters. But here's what makes this tragedy so unbelievable. This wasn't an old ship. It wasn't caught in a violent storm. It wasn't attacked. It was the most advanced passenger ship on Earth, a floating palace that newspapers proudly described as practically unsinkable. So, how could a single iceberg destroy humanity's greatest engineering achievement? Was it simply bad luck, or was the disaster the result of a chain of human mistakes, ignored warnings, overconfidence, and fatal decisions that had been building long before the ship ever touched the ice? More than a century later, scientists, historians, and engineers are still searching for those answers. Because the story of the Titanic isn't just about a ship. It's a story of ambition, innovation, hubris, and the terrible cost of believing something was impossible. This is the story of the RMS Titanic.
It was a new breed of luxury liner.
Titanic left port in Southampton, England.
Among her passengers were many of the wealthy and influential. The band played the gayest tunes and American ragtime dances. The time was 11:40.
The iceberg grazed the right side of the ship.
And all of a sudden she lifted up quickly. Everything that was movable was going through her.
I didn't think it was serious because I didn't think it was possible. I think just like that.
At the beginning of the 20th century, crossing the Atlantic wasn't just transportation. It was a competition. Britain's Cunard Line had two of the fastest passenger ships in the world, the Lusitania and Mauretania. White Star Line needed an answer, but instead of competing purely on speed, they chose something different: size, comfort, and luxury. In 1907, White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay and shipbuilder Lord William Peary developed plans for a new generation of enormous ocean liners, and one of them would become the most famous ship in history, RMS Titanic. Construction began on March 31st, 1909, at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. Thousands of workers helped build the enormous vessel. At nearly 269 meters long, Titanic was one of the largest moving objects ever created by humans at the time. But size wasn't what made Titanic extraordinary. It was what passengers found inside. For first-class travelers, Titanic was essentially a luxury hotel floating across the Atlantic. There was a heated swimming pool, Turkish baths, a gymnasium, libraries, lavish restaurants, and electric elevators. And at the center of it all stood the magnificent grand staircase beneath a huge glass dome. Some of the world's wealthiest people would soon walk through these rooms. But Titanic's greatest selling point wasn't its luxury, it was its safety. Because deep inside the ship, the hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. The system was so advanced for its time that Titanic and her sister ship Olympic were described in the press as practically unsinkable. But the system had a limit. The ship could survive certain combinations of flooded compartments. What it couldn't survive was water entering too many of them at once. Nobody boarding Titanic knew how important that distinction would soon become. After years of construction, Titanic was finally ready for her maiden voyage. Commanding her was 62-year-old Captain Edward John Smith, one of White Star Line's most experienced captains. And on the morning of April the 10th, 1912, Titanic waited at Southampton, England. More than 2,000 passengers and crew would eventually be aboard. Millionaires, businessmen, families, workers, and immigrants hoping to begin new lives in America. They boarded what many believed was one of the safest ships ever built. None of them knew that Titanic had less than 5 days left to live. On April 10th, 1912, Titanic finally began her maiden voyage. She departed Southampton, England. Her destination was New York City. On board were more than 2,200 passengers and crew. Among them were some of the wealthiest people in the world, including American businessman John Jacob Astor IV and industrialist Benjamin Guggenheim. Also aboard were the men who knew Titanic better than almost anyone else: White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay and Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews. For the passengers, the first few days were largely uneventful, but as Titanic traveled farther into the North Atlantic, the situation began to change. By April 12th, Titanic had begun receiving messages from other ships warning about ice ahead. This wasn't completely unusual. Ships crossing the North Atlantic regularly encountered ice during this time of year, but the warnings continued, and on April 14th, Titanic received several more messages reporting icebergs and large fields of ice along or near her route. Yet Titanic continued west at around 21 to 22 knots, close to 40 kilometers per hour. Captain Edward Smith did alter the ship's course slightly farther south, but he did not significantly reduce Titanic's speed, and that night, conditions became particularly dangerous. The sky was dark, there was no moon, the sea was extraordinarily calm. Normally, waves breaking against the base of an iceberg could make it easier for lookouts to see. That night, there were almost no waves, and Titanic was moving quickly into the darkness. At around 11:39 p.m., lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were stationed high above the ship in the crow's nest. Then Fleet saw something directly ahead, a dark shape emerging from the night, an iceberg. Fleet immediately struck the lookout bell 3 times. Then he grabbed the telephone and called the bridge. "Iceberg! Right ahead!" First Officer William Murdoch reacted almost immediately. He ordered the ship to turn sharply and ordered the engines reversed. Down at the wheel, Quartermaster Robert Hichens followed Murdoch's command. Titanic began turning. But a ship this enormous couldn't change direction instantly. The iceberg grew closer and closer. For a moment, it looked as though Titanic might clear it. The bow passed alongside the ice, but beneath the surface, the iceberg struck the ship's starboard side. The impact occurred at approximately 11:40 p.m. Many passengers barely noticed it. Some felt only a slight vibrations. Others heard a strange scraping sound underneath them. There was no enormous head-on crash, no immediate explosion, and above deck, the damage initially didn't look catastrophic. But below the waterline, the situation was very different. The collision had opened the hull to the sea along several points, allowing water to enter multiple forward compartments. Titanic had been designed to survive serious flooding, but not this much. Within minutes, Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews began inspecting the damage with Captain Smith. The situation quickly became clear. Water was entering too many compartments. As the bow sank lower, water would eventually spill over the tops of the internal bulkheads and move progressively farther through the ship. Andrews understood what that meant. Titanic wasn't going to remain afloat. Captain Smith reportedly asked him how long they had. The estimate was devastating. Perhaps an hour and a half, maybe 2, less than an hour earlier. More than 2,000 people had been eating, talking, sleeping, and enjoying one of the safest and most luxurious ships ever built. Now they were trapped in the middle of the freezing North Atlantic, aboard a ship that was going to sink. And there was another problem. Titanic did not have enough lifeboat space for everyone. Thomas Andrews had done the calculations. Titanic was going to sink. There were more than 2,200 people aboard. But Titanic's 20 lifeboats had room for only about 1,178. And somehow, the situation was actually worse than that, because at first, people didn't want to get into them. Think about what passengers could see. Titanic was still brightly lit. There was no massive explosion, and the ship still appeared relatively stable. They were being asked to leave one of the largest ships in the world and climb into a tiny wooden boat hanging above a freezing, pitch-black ocean, so some of the first lifeboats actually left partially empty. Meanwhile, wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were sending distress messages to any ship that could hear them. One ship answered, the RMS Carpathia. Its captain, Arthur Rostron, immediately turned toward Titanic and pushed his ship through the icy Atlantic as quickly as possible. There was just one problem. Carpathia was roughly 58 miles away. Titanic would probably be underwater before it arrived. But another ship was much closer, the SS Californian. Earlier that night, Californian had actually warned Titanic about the ice, but its wireless operator had gone to sleep before Titanic began transmitting its distress calls. Crew members aboard Californian later reported seeing rockets in the distance. Captain Stanley Lord was informed, but the ship never reached Titanic that night. Exactly what Californian's crew saw, and precisely how close the ship was, remains controversial, but it created one of the most haunting questions surrounding Titanic. Could hundreds more people have been saved? Back aboard Titanic, time was disappearing. The bow sank deeper, the deck tilted, and what had begun as an orderly evacuation became increasingly desperate. Women and children were placed into lifeboats, families were separated, and while passengers were trying to escape, hundreds of crew members were still working. Titanic's engineers remained below deck, helping keep the electrical system running. That's why, even while the ship was sinking, Titanic's lights remained on. Wireless operators, Phillips and Bride, continued transmitting distress calls almost until the end. The ship's musicians also continued playing during the evacuation, apparently trying to keep passengers calm. And then there were the passengers who knew they probably weren't leaving. Millionaire John Jacob Astor IV helped his pregnant wife Madeline into a lifeboat. He stayed behind. Benjamin Guggenheim reportedly changed into formal evening clothes after realizing he was unlikely to survive. Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews never escaped, but White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay did. He entered one of the final collapsible lifeboats and survived. The decision would haunt his reputation for the rest of his life. Then, shortly after 2 a.m., Titanic entered its final moments. The bow disappeared deeper beneath the Atlantic. The stern rose high above the water. The electrical system finally failed, and the lights went out. Then the ship's structure gave way. Titanic broke in two. At approximately 2:20 a.m., the remaining stern disappeared beneath the ocean. From collision to disappearance, just 2 hours and 40 minutes had passed, and for hundreds of people thrown into the Atlantic, the sinking wasn't what killed them. The water was around -2 degrees Celsius. Cold shock and hypothermia could kill within minutes. More than 1,500 people died that night. Only around 700 survived. At around 4 a.m., Carpathia finally reached the area, but there was no Titanic left to rescue. Captain Rostron's crew found lifeboats scattered across the ocean and began bringing survivors aboard. By morning, all that remained of the world's largest passenger ship was debris floating across the North Atlantic. But almost immediately, one question began spreading around the world. How did this happen? How did a ship considered practically unsinkable disappear on its very first voyage?